Welcome to the Alaskaland podcast, stories from the Fairbanks North Star Boroughs past, present, and future, with your host, Mayor Bryce Ward. Each episode, we'll sit down with Fairbanks' most interesting characters for a fascinating conversation about where we've been and where we're going. And now, Mayor Ward.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Alaskaland podcast. We're here with Joan today at the Pioneer Museum at Pioneer Park. Joan is a board member and I would say Fairbanks historian. So, Joan, it's a pleasure to have you on the program with us today. And maybe introduce yourself.
Yes, well, I'm a history nut. I love history, and there's so many wonderful stories, and other people are interested, but I like the research, and a lot of people don't like doing the research, so I like to share the research with them.
Well, and you're very good at it. It's my understanding
Thank
you
you.
give presentations. Mm-hmm. You have a standing article in the newspaper too.
Every Monday. Page 3.
So maybe talk a little bit about what it means to be a pioneer, and kind of we're in the Pioneer Museum today.
Yeah.
A little bit about the structure and organization here, and then I understand we're going to talk a little bit about the Wood Famine.
Yeah. Well, the Pioneers of Alaska operate this museum with also the Tanana Yukon Historical Society. We have 2 board members from their organization. And this museum was started by the Pioneers of Alaska. And our organization started in Nome in 1907, and we've been active ever since. And our mission is, part of it is preserving our history, the literature and incidents of Alaska history. So this museum addresses that. And we do everything we can to preserve Fairbanks's history.
And you really do have a bit of everything
and to
here
share
in the
it.
museum.
Yes. And it's just from our pioneer members.
So anyone can become a member, is that right?
Well, we do have the 20-year requirement. You need to be a resident of Alaska for 20 years to be considered for membership. So you're a real Alaskan, we figure, by that time. And other than that, an interest in history and an interest in being a pioneer, it's a lot of fun. You get to do all kinds of crazy stuff. But being a board member on this museum, I never thought I would do that. And here I am. So, yeah.
That's great. And I understand you've done some reenactments as part of that history telling.
Yeah, we did the 1905 Golden Spike reenactment with the Railroad Museum. And that was, oh my gosh, that was so much fun. I hope to do a couple more in the future.
Well, so if folks are interested, definitely come on down, especially if you're a pioneer, been here for 20 years at least.
Yes.
Or more.
Yes.
And join us at the museum. And for those that maybe are not familiar with the park, you can come in from the Riverside, which is, I guess, what's that street? That's
Moore Street.
Moore Street.
Yes.
You're right on the corner there. Or you can come in through the front gate and just to the northeast, west, east of the riverboat.
Yes.
All right.
And one other thing that I would like to say is that we are not an organization exclusively of old people. We have people in their 20s who are members as well. And, we do have a lot of senior citizens that make up our membership, but we also have quite a few younger people.
That's great. And
yes.
Such an awesome experience to be exposed to so much of our history here in the interior, from the gold rush to modern day technology.
It's a pretty exciting history.
It really is.
I love history.
Well, let's talk. I think we've got a few minutes here to talk about the Wood Famine and kind of what that meant for the interior and what happened. Like, what is the Wood Famine?
Oh, I love that question. A wood famine it's not that we ran out of wood. It's that we had to go further and further and further to get wood. And if the further you have to go to get wood, the more expensive the wood becomes. And pretty soon you have an energy crisis where you can't afford the cost of your energy. And in the early days, Fairbanks ran not on a gold economy, it ran on a wood economy. It was the number one occupation More people were employed in wood related business than any other business by far. And wood was the center of everything that happened here. And we only had one energy source. That was it. And so they started cutting the trees, and all the heat, all the cooking, all the power generation, which we did have electricity right away early on. All of it came from wood.
So what was the time frame that we're talking about here? This is like turn of the century from when Fairbanks was originally founded?
Well, the first tree was cut in July of 1901 by the deckhand on the Lavelle Young. His name was Angus McDougall, and that was recorded in Captain Adams's diary. So we know when the first tree was cut. And once that tree was cut, every tree in the river drainages for miles and miles around here were on death row right then, from that moment on, because that was our only energy source.
And the river was the transportation source, right?
Yes.
So folks would use you'd use the river for transportation or to float wood material down to the city.
Yeah, well, what they did was there was a whole distribution network that was set up. You would start with the wood cutters, and so you would have a couple guys who would have a partnership, two men. Sometimes, you might have 5, 6 in the group if it was a larger cutting operation, and you had to go get an area to cut. And unlike how you would think, we're in this wilderness and we can just go cut anywhere. No. Just like today, it was all owned by the federal government. You could not just willy-nilly go and cut. There was some oversight in this. So you would go out, you would get an area to cut, kind of like the permitting system that we have today. And you would go out and you would cut. You would not cut everything because you only wanted the wood that was worth money. It was worth your while to cut, because after you were done, the stumpage assessor, who worked for the federal government, would come out and count the stumps, and you had to pay a stump tax on every stump that was cut. So if you have a scrawny little thing that's like 1 inch diameter and, kind of gnarled over this way and that way, you're not going to cut that scrawny little thing. You're going to leave it because otherwise you have to pay the stump tax on it. So when you look at pictures, you will see that there's these scrawny looking trees here and there, but there's no good sized timber. And that was because of the stumpage tax. So these guys would go out, they would cut these, and then they would haul the wood to a trail. And then some other guys would come and they would have contracts to pick these little stashes up, and they would take them to another point, usually next to the river or next to a river trail. And then from there, it would be brought in to town or into the mining camp where it would be stored. These giant woodlots would be created and they would be stored. And this is like having giant fuel tanks. There was a great big one that's roughly where Seacon sits today.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, big, really big.
So the early economy of Fairbanks was wood driven.
Yes.
The
very much so.
Energy, every source of energy was pretty much derived by wood.
Yes.
And how long did this last?
Until the Alaska Railroad was built.
So
and the moratorium on coal was lifted.
Gotcha. So coal became a more prominent source of energy at that point.
Oh, yeah. Well, they knew that coal was down near Healy. And, there was an all-water route, so it would have been easier to get coal here. We couldn't use coal because of Teddy Roosevelt. He got into a big argument. This was during the Gilded Age. A lot of his presidential politics revolved around busting up these big monopolies, the Carnegies, the J.P. Morgans, the, It's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, the busting up these monopolies that had a lock on all the energy, all the transportation, everything in the lower 48. So to bust up the coal monopolies, he used an executive order, and he had a moratorium put on developing any new coal prospects, which canned all of Alaska's coal. We couldn't use it. We couldn't, because we didn't have any developed coal mines. So that's why we had to burn wood. What's ironic about this is that Teddy Roosevelt prided himself greatly on saving America's forests, but he didn't save them here.
Not here in the interior.
No.
We cut them all down.
Everything, yes.
Oh, goodness.
Yes.
And this is one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of really big trees in the Fairbanks area, or anything that's over 100 some years old.
1914, all the big trees, the biggest ones, our oldest ones would be 1914 and later.
Gotcha. Yeah. Unless you go out farther out of town. And so this went for
even
quite some
further
ways.
out of town. Even further out of town.
My goodness.
They had to cut saw logs. They had to go way up the Goodpasture River for saw logs by the time, the late teens hit. And they would freight them in the winter on the ice. In the summertime, they would float booms of logs down the river. To give you an idea of some of the cutting, if you go to Chena Hot Springs, and that beautiful drive through the state forest and all those gorgeous trees. Well, by 1914, there's a newspaper article that talks about they had clear cut for a mile either side of the Chena River. So that's a 2-mile wide swath, the entire length of the river, all the way up to Chena Hot Springs, all the trees.
Oh, my goodness.
From Fairbanks, yes.
So that entire forest is a
by
newer
1914.
Growth. By 1914. Wow.
The wood famine actually started in 1906 in Fairbanks. And it started before that on the Yukon River. There was a wood famine along the Yukon because all those steamboats burned wood and they cut all the easy-to-get-to wood. And it got so bad that the Northern Commercial Company converted 3 of their steamers, 3 of their bigger ones, to oil. But to have oil, they had to set up a distribution network along the river. And that was a major, major undertaking, and you have to supply that. Well, there was only one oil tanker for the entire Pacific coast, and that tanker was the Rosecrans, and it had to supply everything along the whole western coast of the United States, including Alaska. So it was, you'd only get one shipment a year, and they had big tanks at St. Michael's, and then they had some at Andrewski, and I don't remember the other. There was 2 more locations going up the river to supply these boats. But they saved a fortune. Even though that was expensive, it was way cheaper than trying to burn wood because wood was getting harder and harder to get.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that we were so dependent on that resource.
We were.
Here in the interior and throughout the state of Alaska, it sounds like.
Because of Washington politics. That's the interesting part. We did have other energy sources. We weren't allowed to use them.
Interesting.
And, it got so bad that people couldn't afford to heat their homes anymore. And just a few years ago, we saw a similar situation. The price of oil shot up and they couldn't afford to heat their home. So some people were saying, well, I'm going to have to move. And people had to leave starting about 1910, I think it was, to 1914. People were moving away from here because of the energy costs.
What was the population about for the interior at that time?
You would ask
know?
that.
Oh, goodness.
I don't, yeah. I'm not sure. The population was definitely down by that time, but I don't know the exact number.
Gotcha.
Not off the top of my head. I can tell you how much wood they were burning.
Well, let's talk about that. Maybe if you got some quantities and
so
talk about what the landscape looked like.
Let me start asking you a question. How big's a big wood pile to you? If you saw it and you would go, that's a big wood pile. How many cords?
I've seen 100 cord piles before.
That's nothing.
Nothing?
That's
okay.
Nothing. Yeah. So the NC Power Plant, which was located downtown, and it supplied only part of the power to Fairbanks because it was another power plant. It supplied part of the power and steam heat to the core area. And today, Aurora Energy still supplies steam heat to the downtown core area. That power plant burned more than 14,000 cords in a winter. And that did not supply household heat to most homes in Fairbanks or cooking. 14,000 cords a winter, yes. Out on the creeks, so you have Esther, you have Goldstream, you have Cleary, you have Chattanooga, you have Fairbanks Creek. Out on all these creeks, I don't remember how many creeks we have, but it's quite a few. All the boilers on these creeks, and every couple claims had a boiler. Mm-hmm. And these boilers all burned wood, and they supplied the power to run the mining equipment. This wasn't for heating. This wasn't for cooking. This was just for powering mining equipment. On the creeks, it was roughly 751 cords of wood a day consumed on those creeks collectively. And every bit of that wood was cut by hand with saws like you see looking down that wall down there.
So these are those hand saws, right? The
hand
big blades.
Saws, yes.
Oh my goodness.
Two guys pulling the saws. Yes, we didn't have chainsaws. So that was a lot of wood.
Yeah, and I've done my fair amount of wood chopping in my day, and I can only imagine, these weren't like firewood size pieces. These are probably 3-4 foot in length.
You would cut, they cut 4 foot, 8 foot, and 16 foot. And depending on, a lot of it started out as 16-foot lengths. Saw logs, definitely 16-foot lengths. Mm-hmm. And it would be brought into town. And then for household use, they had, down at the end of the building here, you can see a saw truck. And they would come up and pull up to your house, and they would custom cut the wood to fit your stove because there wasn't uniformity in the size of the logs that stoves took.
So you'd bring the raw logs in for your home and then cut it to fit.
It would be custom cut by these wood cutters. And so as the price went up, there were lawsuits over who owned the rights to certain log piles. Forest fires, when they raged through, would consume these big log piles. Well, that's like having your tank farm go up in smoke. It was devastating when that happened. And you wouldn't read about people's homes burning. No, you read about the wood piles that were lost.
Oh, my goodness.
It was a very precious commodity. And it was, it's really amazing when you think about it. And then they taxed you on how much wood you kept at your house in town, because having those wood piles in the city core area were a fire hazard in themselves. So if you wanted a big wood pile, you had to pay more for it.
So you paid a stump tax, and then you also paid a firewood pile tax?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the stump tax was a federal tax. And
yes.
The wood pile, is that a local tax?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I'm not sure exactly all the ins and outs of how that worked, but I would suspect that it probably helped to fund the fire department. Common sense says that. And I always wondered what people thought of the stumpage assessor when he came into town. Was he booed and hissed on the street? I don't know. I'm guessing he probably wasn't a very popular guy.
Tax collectors rarely are.
Yeah. But we had a whole distribution system, to bring wood in, and it got burned in these copious amounts. It was the Alaska Railroad. Part of getting the Alaska Railroad built was because it was a strategic thing for national defense, because our Healy coal reserves, Falcon Jocelyn and Judge Wickersham got them deemed as being strategic. Mm-hmm. And this was for national security and national defense. And that was what got Congress to finally fund the Alaska Railroad.
And once the railroad was built, this resource was able to flow more freely into the Fairbanks community.
Yeah, it was. And everything went to coal after that. And that conversion to coal didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually. You can't just put coal in a regular wood stove. You have to do some modifications or just get a new stove. So they started out with just selling these little sacks of coal that would come in on the train here and there. And then as demand grew, we had the coal bunkers. And
I remember the coal bunkers.
That's one of my earliest memories, was going and getting coal. Yes. Yeah. And it's funny because when I grew up, there was still a lot of coal that was burned. And that was the smell of a warm house, Nobody really thought that much about coal's dirty or coal's bad, or, people were still pretty grateful for it. I think a lot of the people around here could remember when they had to burn wood, and they felt that coal was a step up.
Coal was almost better than wood in some ways. Back in the day, it sounds like.
Depends on your perspective. Yeah. Yeah. But, the interesting thing about all of that is that here we were, we had another resource that we could easily use, but we weren't allowed to use it because of something that was decided on the East Coast of the United States. And that's why I started doing all the research.
So I'm curious. I grew up. My dad's a firewood saw guy. Mm-hmm. Would they differentiate between firewood and saw material? So when they were harvesting the wood in the interior, was it most valuable as firewood at that point, or was saw timber a commodity at that point?
Oh, we had 8 sawmills in town. And they ripped that wood as fast as they could rip it. Anything that was big went through the sawmill. Anything that was smaller went to household use.
Gotcha.
And by the time we got into the 19-teens, even wood that had been killed in a forest fire was being used, because wood was becoming harder and harder to get. They were having to go further and further. They would go downriver and cut and then bring it up on the steamers. And you'll see boats with all this wood on the deck. And actually, that was an in-sea boat. And, it would have wood on the deck that was for Fairbanks consumption. They're bringing it upriver from these downriver wood camps. And, and a lot of the labor went away when the railroad started being built. Everybody went and took those railroad jobs. And there was a real shortage because of that. Dredging didn't happen in Fairbanks until the 1930s because of this wood shortage. All those dredges were electric, and they used coal-fired power generation to supply the electricity to the FE company dredges. The very first dredge here was a wood-burning dredge that they brought here in 1912 or 1913, and it operated on Fairbanks Creek. And they ordered their wood 4,000 to 4,500 cords at a time, and that they would do like 2 or 3 orders a season for that wood.
Wow. Is that the one that's still out there? No, it's long gone?
No, it's long gone.
Okay.
But it was a Risdon dredge, and it was floated here. It was the very first dredge in the Yukon, and it was floated here and disassembled and set up on Fairbanks Creek, and it operated there for several years. And that's what kind of paved the way for the FE dredgers that came in later. But they couldn't operate until we had coal.
Needed a more steady supply of energy.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
I think I'm thinking about the amount of wood that you're talking about, and
it's mind-numbing.
Someone must have been tasked with filling the firebox all the time. I mean, it must have been burning so hot, so fast that I imagine someone just continually throwing wood into this thing.
Women and children. That was a domestic job.
Filling the firebox.
Yes, in the home, yes. That was, the men didn't do that. That was, women and children did that. Lots of women chopped wood. The men, they fed boilers pretty much. But yeah, and it was an ongoing, never-ending thing, There's a lot of labor involved in wood.
Certainly. And many of us still do that today.
Well, and if you think you're tough, you've cut wood. One guy, there was a newspaper article about him that this has just amazed me. He was a one-armed woodcutter. He had lost his arm in an accident, and he still was a woodcutter. And over the course of 2 years, single-handedly, this man cut 1,800 cords of wood.
Single-handedly. No pun.
No pun. Yes. 1,800 cords of wood in 2 years. And that is, I don't know any men that are that tough. That's a tough man.
That is definitely a lot of work.
Yes. Yeah. And, he did all of that and he made his living. And part of it was he probably didn't have a choice. If you can't work, your options were really grim in those days. So he found a way to work. But I can't picture pulling a saw with one arm like that. And I'm wondering what he ate.
A lot of Wheaties.
Yeah. And it was... today all of our trees have grown back and we always have the threat of forest fires. And for many years, I always think about this when fire season comes because now we have mature forests again. And that poses a threat to people's property in a way that it didn't for many, many years. So basically from the 19-teens until the 1960s, we didn't have all of that mature forest to threaten property the way that we do. And now it's all mature forest. And so once a fire springs up, it just takes off.
It's definitely a concern. I mean, we've dealt with that for a number of years with a lot of those older growth forests that are, have now come back.
Yeah. But we still have wood cutting that goes on. Commercial wood cutting, if you drive the Hot Springs Road, you'll see some of those wood trucks hauling, especially in the spring. And, I always think about the wood famine when I see them and I smile. And, we still argue about over who can burn what. We still have issues today about, we're under pressure, political pressure to use certain fuel sources over other fuel sources. So I always think that it's really interesting that we've been here before. We're going to keep revisiting it, It's just part of life here.
So the wood discussion on air quality and cost of energy is literally goes back 100 years.
All the way to day one. And, it's when you look at the pictures and you see in the 1930s the denuded hills that aerial pictures, and you can see that it's just hill after hill after hill. They had an initial cutting radius of within 5 miles of the city was open for cutting, a 5-mile radius, and they had to extend it out to 7, and then it got extended out to 11. And they kept thinking, okay, this will meet our needs. We'd never need more than that. And they would just burn it up. And then the river valleys, that's where they were getting the saw logs, the really big logs. And, all of those went and they built everything here. Every building was made out of wood. We didn't have steel buildings. And we didn't have concrete or masonry because that had to come in by a riverboat and it was too expensive. Before the Alaska Railroad, every building was made out of wood too. Everything was wood.
That's just phenomenal.
They even used the sawdust, They would insulate with it.
I think I've seen a few buildings with that old sawdust packed away in the walls.
Yes. And, our town burned more than once because everything was made of wood. And So it had some pretty serious consequences, but at the same time, that's what was here. It was what was readily available.
Local renewable resource, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Just takes about 100 years to grow back.
Pretty much. I also, when I do the Wood Famine show, I sum it up with a picture of the Clay Street Cemetery. And in that picture, you see those beautiful big trees there. And those trees date to about 1914. And I remind people that the people that the wood famine greatly impacted, the people that cut all of the trees, are lying under those old growth trees today. And it's kind of neat that they're there as a reminder, if you know the story. And they are on top of all those people.
From the earth we come, and there we go back.
Yes. And every one of those people that are in that cemetery cut wood. In
pretty
one
much
way
guaranteed,
or another.
right? Yes,
guaranteed. Yes.
Well, this has been really fascinating, and I know you do these presentations for community groups.
Different
is that right?
Groups, yes.
So if folks were interested in maybe learning more about this or some other aspect of Fairbanks history, could they come down to the museum, speak to you about that? Is that a great way for folks to connect?
I also do for groups. They contact me, and they have a meeting and then a program afterwards. I've done them for the Nolween Library. We usually just put them on the online calendars around town. So if you ever see one for the Wood Famine and you want to really know more, just attend it the next time you see it.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, Joan, thank you for spending some time today to talk about the Pioneer Museum, to talk about Pioneers of Alaska and the Wood Famine. I look forward. I know we're going to talk about a few other things on some future episodes. So I look forward to that opportunity.
Well, thank you.
Fairbanks, oh Fairbanks.
Thanks for listening to the Alaskaland podcast. We hope you found today's conversation enlightening. For more episodes, listen on your mobile device through your favorite podcast app, or watch at youtube.com/Fairbanks North Star Borough.
Above the adventure soul that live and breathe the Alaskan dream are